Well, good evening, everyone. I've done quite a lot of Zoom talks over the past few years. I still find it a rather artificial environment compared to talking to people live. So I do apologise if it sounds a bit artificial from time to time, but I'll do my best. And one thing I should say before I start is I'm not really going to look at the technical side of map making. That's really quite a different talk. What I'm looking at is really just the way that Cambridgeshire has been shown on maps since the Middle Ages, and what the maps can tell us as local historians. Are they useful as sources for local history? What do they show? What don't they show? And in some cases, why is the map maker actually selecting the information that he is? And I should say from the start, I grew up with maps. From as long as I can remember. There were maps in the house, largely because my father, who worked for the post office when I was young, was responsible for mapping the mail van routes and postman's cycling routes around the North Yorkshire moors. And so every evening there were maps on the table as he worked out the best routes. Also, interestingly, plotting which farms he knew that postmen could get a breakfast at, which in the North Yorkshire moors in winter is obviously quite important. So here we go. And of course, it's very difficult for us nowadays to imagine a world without maps, whether they're the paper maps that we're all familiar with, Satnav, GPS, whatever it may be. Maps are all around us. And this one is perhaps the one that we all look at more than any other, the weather map on the BBC. And they also dictate how we actually see the world around us. And in some cases, this can be quite misleading. And one of the best known maps of the 20th century, of course, is this Harry Beck's 1934 map of the London Underground. The very first attempt at actually making sense of the underground. Beck was an electrical engineer by background, and his map, as you can see, very much is very clearly, it's a sort of wiring diagram showing the different tube lines in a very schematic format. And I think for most people, certainly non-Londoners, this gives us our idea of the geography of London, but actually gives us a rather misleading view because, of course, distances are foreshortened or lengthened in some cases. It doesn't give much indication of what's on the surface, but we do know what is what, where it is. And of course, this map is still the basis of the London Underground map today, and here it is. The trouble is, of course, that Beck's original simplicity has now disappeared. It's been overlain by the tube lines that have been built since the 1930s, even more so by the London Overground. And it is actually, compared to the original map, very difficult to interpret these days, particularly the pocket-sized map, which is almost illegible unless you've actually got a magnifying glass. But nonetheless, it is still a very interesting map. But to go back and start at the very beginning, let's go back to the Middle Ages. And let's start outside Cambridgeshire, really with how people tried to make sense of the world in the Middle Ages. And medieval maps to us are very strange indeed, because they're not really intended to explain what geography was. They are more intended to be spiritual and biblical explanations of the world, with odd bits of geographical information thrown in. And they nearly all follow this format, which is called the TO format. So here you've got the T, here you've got the O. Invariably, you've got Asia at the top, Europe, Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. And always East is at the top, Orient's up there, because this, of course, is not only where the sun rises, it's also where the second coming of Christ was expected. And the best known of these maps is this one, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, a remarkable piece of work from round about 1300 or thereabouts, centred on Jerusalem. Again, east is up at the top there, and it's got about 500 of these tiny drawings, which you can see here, which are showing cities, biblical events, plants, animals, people, mythical creatures, so on and so forth. It is an incredibly complex piece of work which we still don't, I think, fully understand. And it is obviously completely useless from the point of view of geography. The British Isles are down here, it is not a realistic view of the world. And medieval people just didn't use maps in the way that we do. Domesday, which of course is the great survey of 11th century England, hasn't got a single map. It is text. And as we can see here, the usual pattern was to describe geography in words. And Mary Hesse, many years ago, 30 years ago now, in this article on the Anglo-Saxon boundaries of Littlebury, which is just over the border from Cambridgeshire, Essex, gives this example. And here it is, these are the bounds of Littlebury. And she walks round, or the surveyor walks round from the Ford and the boundary of Ickleton, boundary of Littlebury along the Cam, as far as the narrow ford, from the narrow road to Streatham to the old pit, from the pit as far as the fence, as far as the wolf pit, very carefully if we're walking around Littlebury with the wolf pit, from the pit to the southern part of Bottle's Corner Wood, as far as the old enclosure, and so it goes on. And there are many of these descriptions around. The first attempt really to map Great Britain is this. Matthew Paris, a map of St Albans, a monk from St Albans, who drew this map round about 1260. And we don't know why he did it. We don't know how much he knew about the geography of Britain. He gets the shape sort of more or less right, although, as you'll notice, this is Scotland at the top. He shows Scotland actually as an island with the Firth of Clyde there, the Firth of Forth there. He marks on the various rivers, he marks on towns, etc. And also, this is probably the very first map to have north at the top in the way that we would expect it nowadays. Moving slightly closer to home, because Cambridgeshire doesn't really figure on that one at all, we've got this, what is called the Goth map, of round about 1360, sometime in the middle of the 14th century. Now, this map, again, is a bit of a mystery, in the sense that we don't know who drew it. Almost certainly, probably, it's monastic, once again, and it's called the Goth map after the Oxford antiquarian who discovered it in the 18th century. This, you may take a moment to catch what's going on here, but basically we're looking here at East Anglia with north at the top. So over here, we've got the North Norfolk coastline. Over here on the other side, we've got the Thames estuary with London down at the bottom there. And the various rivers are shown. Here's the River Lee. Here's the River Stort. Here's a rather fanciful representation of the Great Ouse. And one or two roads. You can see this road here moving across. And if we zoom in, and I'm sorry about the quality of this, it's not a particularly clear illustration. Here we are, here is Cambridgeshire being shown for the first time, or at least Cambridge being shown for the first time. There it is. And here is the road, which is the road going from London up to Norwich. And there's a handful of places shown. Newmarket, obviously, because it's an important point on the road. Saffron Walden, and curiously, Babraham. Now, why Babraham should have been chosen when other villages aren't, I really don't know. It does seem rather odd. But nonetheless, here we are on the map. Well, there are a number of these late medieval maps, and by the 16th century, map making is really developing, and there are a number of developments in the 16th century, which mean that there is a new impetus to to publish maps. And the first and perhaps the most important is that at the Reformation, of course, a lot of land that belonged to the church, to the monasteries, is secularized. It goes to new landowners who really basically want to know what they've got. And there is a sense, I think, of a pride of ownership. You'd like a map showing your new land holdings to put on the wall of the Great Hall or wherever it may be, just as a status symbol. And also, of course, the fact that there is now much more complex land holding, there tend to be a lot more legal disputes over who actually owns what, over common land, for example. And this is coupled with a number of other factors. There is a new interest in the 16th century in investigating and exploiting natural resources. And as far as we're concerned, there's this new interest in fen drainage. There are concerns over internal and external security. The government wants to know what the strong points and what the weak points in national defence are. And there's also this idea of the nationalism. For the first time, as a result of a Reformation, as much as anything else, there is this sense of English patriotism, a sense of wanting to find out about the history, about the geography of the country. For the first time, local histories are being written. It's what's sometimes called the discovery of England. People are now much more interested in their surroundings. There is this sense of local patriotism. Not surprising, people didn't talk about my county. They always talk about my country when they're talking about Cambridgeshire or Lincolnshire, wherever else it may be. And also, there are far more sophisticated surveying techniques. So there are now a lot more maps around. And this is a very good example of an estate map. And this is Bolsham in 1617. Mapped for St Thomas's Hospital, the landowners, and it's a very detailed map showing landholding, showing the strips, what had been the strips in the open fields are now gardens. And if you know Babraham at all, this is still recognisable. This is still the main street. You go into Babraham, here's the Z Bend round, and you carry on out towards West Wickham, Haverhill, etc. A lovely piece of work. And also you're getting maps of counties. And there are two important figures here. The first is Christopher Saxton, who lived from 1542 to 1620. And Saxton was effectively map maker to the government. He was supported financially by Cecil, Elizabeth I's chief minister, and the maps were produced, subsidised by the government, and in 1579 he mapped Cambridgeshire. This is a later reprint. This is a 17th century reprint. But what the map shows for the very first time are the towns and villages of Cambridgeshire. And here we are, an enlargement of the southeastern bit of Cambridgeshire. And we've got most, not all, but most of the villages marked, sometimes with rather strange names. And he also distinguishes for the first time towns and villages. So market towns are shown in this rather sort of fanciful, with large churches in them. He shows one or two parks, like Horseheath, for example, one over here near West Ratting, Chesterford Park down here. He shows the rivers, and the geography is more or less right. And one of the features of this map, which we find a lot of others in the 17th and 18th century, is the importance given to reach, which, of course, nowadays we think of just as a very small village. And I think this reflects the importance of Reach Fair, one of the great trading fairs of the late Middle Ages, the early modern period. And it is somewhere that people would want to know where it actually is. The other important figure is John Speed. 1552 to 1629. And this is his map of Cambridgeshire of 1610. Now, once again, there is a lot that we don't know about how this map is produced. And the one thing that's very clear is that, like so many map makers in the 17th and 18th century, he cheerfully plagiarized any other maps he could get his hands on. And he certainly, I think, taken a lot of Saxton and just simply copied. And nonetheless, he does seem to have done some work by himself, and particularly the town plans, which appear here. So Cambridge itself appears up in the top left-hand corner there. And also, one of the important features of this map is the contrast between South Cambridgeshire, upland Cambridgeshire, and the Fens. The fact that virtually no information is at all is shown about the Fens, hardly any towns, hardly any villages. And I think this is important in the sense of stimulating this new interest in fen drainage in the late 16th, early 17th century. This does seem to be a totally undeveloped region, ripe for exploitation. And we shall see in due course what that led to. He surrounds all of his maps with coats of arms, so he's got all the arms of the Cambridge colleges here. And he also often includes these fanciful figures, which in the case of Cambridge are, of course, connected with the university. So you've got the, pardon me, you have the humanities, as it were, down here, divinity and classics, and you've got the mathematical sciences on the other side here, with looks as if something rather unfortunate about to happen to this chap here, but nonetheless. And he didn't have room to include Ely on the Cambridgeshire map, and so Ely has to be put onto Huntingdonshire. So this is the Huntingdonshire map. It's a much smaller map, again showing the relative bareness of the fens compared to the rest of the county, and also the very first published map of Huntingdon itself here. Moving on to Cambridge, and this, of course, is very well known. This is the map produced by Richard Lyon, the very first map of the town itself in 1574. And Lyon was not a native. He was a Londoner. He was a printer, a painter, and an engraver. And it seems that this map was produced for Dr. Keyes of Gondel and Keyes College, who was trying to prove that Cambridge was an older university than Oxford, and quite a lot of the writing up here in Latin is devoted to this. And this map, of course, becomes the basis of many, many maps produced over the next 50 to 100 years. And everything is shown, it's a combination between the bird's eye view and the map. So you've effectively got the streets shown in plan, and you've got the buildings shown in elevation, with one or two obvious distortions. Running out of paper up here, he's had to introduce a non-existent pen just as you get over Magdalen Bridge. There you are, more or less up at the Museum of Cambridge. And down here, we're at the southern end of the town, somewhere just really beyond Peterhouse. It's also an interesting map because it does show the very close relationship between the town and agriculture. It's a very small town and it's surrounded by agricultural land. There are all sorts of animals grazing and doing other things and out in the fields. There are crops over here in the sort of Christ Pieces area. There are men fishing on the river. Come on, there we are. The town itself, the houses, are shown very conventionally. He makes no attempt to really show them individually. He makes a little attempt on the colleges to give some indication of their plan. And again, churches are shown more or less conventionally, and often with rather odd names, St. Clement, for example, and the lovely St. Pulchre's. And of course, what's happened here is that this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And what he's recorded is what is obviously the local pronunciation. It's become Sepulchre's, St. Pulchre's, and this continues, in fact, right through the 18th century. You still get the church being called St. Pulchre's, so these errors live on. And Lyon's map was used as a basis by lots of other cartographers over the next few years, and really very quickly. And this is a German, effectively, edition of Lyon, 1575, by Johannes Braun, in his book called Civitas Orbis Terrarum, which is a five-volume series of town maps which were published in Cologne in the late 16th, early 17th century. And he mapped 18 British towns. Cambridge is one of them. And he's obviously basically just copied Line. He's added one or two features of his own, particularly, for example, down here, Line showed a very fanciful version of Cambridge Castle. Brown has elaborated it even further into a sort of medieval Gothic fantasy. He's put in a number of the things that Line showed, the people fishing in the river, the boats, for example. He's added the animals down here, slightly more realistically, I think, than Line did. And he's also put in these three human figures. And it's generally agreed that he did this for effectively security reasons. It's a time when Western Europe was very concerned with the threat from the East, the threat from the Ottomans. And he felt that putting human figures onto the map would mean that the Turks wouldn't use it because the Islamic faith forbade its believers to actually look on representations of the human form. So consequently, the map would be safe and it wouldn't be a great deal of use. And this is just another example. This is Fuller, 1634. Again, very, very clearly based on Line. And this one, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, this is the great might have been of Cambridge mapping. Hammond's map of 1592. This very large scale and very accurate map of the late 16th century in 9 sheets, of which only one survives in usable form. And this is it. It's been reproduced a lot. Hammond himself was a fellow of Clare College and seems to have been quite expert on surveying. Later went out to become the vicar of Great Gransden. It's more or less the scale, 1 inch to 120 feet. And it shows, as you can see, very clearly and very realistically in this case, the college buildings, although the housing is still shown, I think, really just very conventionally. Obviously, it would simply be too much for one man to map and show realistically every single property. Moving into the 17th century, county maps. This is Thomas Jenner. His map of Cambridgeshire and its surrounding area, 1635, in a book which he called Direction for the English Traveller. And it's a book of county maps, and he claims, as I put it here, that by the map, if you're a traveller, you will be enabled to coast about and may know in what parish, village, mansion house ere he be in, which way he's to travel until he come to his journey's end. Which I think is a bit over-exaggeration because it doesn't actually show any roads. So no matter what parish, village or mansion house you're in, how you get to the next village is not clear. And 1643, second year of the English Civil War, I don't think there would actually be many civilian takers for the map. But what it shows, and this again becomes very common for the first time, are the mileages between the major towns and villages of the county and Huntingdonshire, and once again including, you'll notice down here, reach figures and one or two other really very small places that we wouldn't think of, like Llangingley and Sutton, for example. The map itself is quite small and as you can see, not really a great deal of use. Moving to the end of the 17th century, we do again get the very well-known map produced by pardon me, David Logan, 1688. Logan, official engraver to Cambridge University, obviously producing the map with official support. And this is the first really accurate map of the town that we have. This one, in a sense, you could almost overlay on a modern Ordnance Survey map, and it wouldn't show a great deal of difference. So we've got rid for the family of this non-existent bend at the Bridge Street end. We've got a much more realistic depiction of the castle, simply showing the castle mound, the earthworks. We've got the colleges shown very carefully in plan and distinguished from the rest of the town, and it's a beautiful piece of work. And of course, it's accompanied by the engravings of each of the colleges, which this is Keys, and all of these, again, are accurate as far as the colleges are concerned. They show the layout of the buildings very, very clearly. And so here at Keys, we've got Gonville Court and Keys Court. We've got the Gate of the Gate of Humility, the Gate of Virtue, the Gate of Honour, the Master's Garden over here. But what we've also got, interestingly, is a Senate House passage shown as a main road. Now, there are two problems with this. First of all, because it wasn't a main road, there was no way you could possibly get a horse and cart down Senate House passage. And secondly, it didn't actually go any further than here. And it's the bottom end of it that existed. There wasn't a Senate House passage here. This was simply housing along the back of what was to become the Senate House, but he doesn't show it because it would obviously rather spoil the overall impression. And equally fanciful, of course, are his, again, famous views of the town from the east and the west, again, showing the skyline of the town very accurately, but with, again, completely fanciful foregrounds here. So looking from the west, this road, which is running somewhere, I would guess, in terms of distance over in the Grange Road area, simply didn't exist. Outside Cambridge in the 17th century is fen drainage, which is important, with schemes being put forward from the 1590s onwards, and finally taken forward from 1630 by Francis Russell, 4th Earl of Bedford, who was one of the new fen landowners, major estates in the Thorney area and elsewhere in the fens, and this is him on the left-hand side here. He's a very interesting character in the sense that in 1639-1640, when the fen drainage scheme, or the first stage of it, had been carried out, he found himself in Parliament as an effectively intermediary between the two sides, between King on the one hand and Parliament on the other. And it's often been suggested that because he was trusted by both, had he lived, the Civil War might have been avoided. As it was, he died from smallpox in 1640, and we all know what happened 2 years later. Bedford is the instigator. The man who carries out the great scheme is here, Sir Cornelius Vermuyden, the Dutchman, who'd been working up in the Lincolnshire Fenlands in the late 1620s, Canvey Island at the same period, and it's Vermuyden who works out what is to be done. And of course, his great scheme is the Bedford River, running from Erith to Denver Sluice, across the fens, cutting off the great big loop of the River Ouse round through Ely, designed to take floodwater directly to the sea. And this is one of the two Bedford rivers, the old one of in the 1630s, the new one in the 1650s, which nowadays we look at them and think, oh, it's just another Fenland drain, not very interesting. And it's only really when you look at them from the air that you appreciate the actual scale of what Vermuyden was doing. So here we're looking north from Erith. Here is the old Bedford on the left. Here's the new Bedford, the 1650s river on the right there. And what is happening here, of course, is you've got the ooze washes in between. Effectively, this great floodwater storage basin designed to catch high tides coming in from the sea, designed to hold floodwater coming down from inland. And it's good to remember that this is entirely dug by hand, by local people in some cases, although many of them were bitterly opposed to it, and by Scottish and Dutch prisoners of war. And it's the biggest civil engineering work in Britain to be carried out since the days of the Romans. Well, Ferdinand mentioned died in 1640. Work was interrupted by the Civil War. 1649, it started again under the auspices of a new body called the Bedford Level Corporation. Um, the Bedford Level Corporation, which existed right down to the 20th century, more or less forgotten today, but it is effectively the predecessor of the river authorities of the 20th century. And the only really tangible reminder of it, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with, is in Ely, on what was the Fen Office, the headquarters of the Bedford Level Corporation. It's now, I think, a solicitor's office, where you've got their coat of arms. And so here you've got the actual coat of arms of the corporation. On the left-hand side, you've got a drainer. On the right-hand side, you've got a farmer or an agricultural labourer, complete with a scythe. Well, by 1659, the work had been more or less finished. They were very proud of what they'd done, and they commissioned, pardon me, Sir Jonas Moore, 1658, sorry, to produce a map to show what had been achieved. And this is the map which you can buy in reproduction today from the Cambridgeshire Records Society. A massive map, great piece of work, designed once again to be hung on the wall of their London offices and to show just what they'd done. It shows very, very clearly the various fields and fens. Here we've got the River Cam, so right down here in the bottom is Horningsea. Here you've got Waterbeach and Cottenham. It shows the various bits of fen, and it also shows the bits of land that were given to the adventurers, as they were called, the people who put their money into the drainage scheme, all marked as lots. And this, of course, is one reason why there was so much opposition for drainage and the fens, that fen people thought that they were losing land to these London capitalists, and obviously their traditional way of life being destroyed, and they didn't like it. And this was also in the late 17th century. This is, pardon me, 1688. The Bedford Level Corporation produced a map of the whole county, which was by Philip Lee. And again, it's a rather nice piece of work, a very accurate map. Again, with the town plans of Cambridge and Ely here, various bits of information round about. As we move into the 18th century, there is really quite an explosion of map making. And one reason for this is, of course, that people are more mobile in the years after the Restoration. And strip maps of roads start to become important. And this is the John Ogilvy's map of round about 1680, 1690. This is probably a later reprint of it. And this isn't actually in Cambridgeshire, this is Suffolk and Essex, but it is as near as I could get on what I had available. And it's showing, as you can see, the roads from Chelmsford to St Edmundsbury and Saffron Walden. So here you've got the road to Saffron Walden on the right. Saffron Walden is up here. And again, many of you know this, it's the old A130, now the B184, coming down through Thaxted, down here, down to Dunmow, down to that awful hill that you've got to try and sort of get out of when you're driving and just hope nothing is really coming, along past this rather mysterious Black Chapel, and down towards Chelmsford. And showing various things as you go along, and a stream of river running on the way, a chapel, showing various stately homes and things like that. And as the century goes on, we seem to get more and more of these county maps, some more accurate than others. This is Thomas Baddeslade, 1742, from Chorographica Britannia. And nearly all of these maps, I should stress, were not produced individually. They're normally produced in books, atlases. Nowadays, of course, when they're on the market, as they often are, it is individual sheets. This shows to some extent the geography of the county. You've certainly got the Old Bedford and New Bedford rivers shown there. And you've got quite a lot of information on the other side here about Cambridge, Caxton, Linton, all the market towns. Chatteris seems to have defeated him. He's left Chatteris totally blank for some reason. He's got all the others in. Down here, you've got the foundation of the colleges, and you've got some of the main roads shown reasonably accurately. Kitchen and Jeffreys, 1749, is another more or less contemporary example. And again, with this usual bit of information down at the bottom here, telling you when the market days are in various places, and showing the roads moderately accurately in this case. There are quite a number of question marks about them. So, for example, if we start in Cambridge and go down on the A10, we go down through Melbourne. And of course, what he's got here, he's got it totally wrong because the road should go from Melbourne to Royston. He's actually got it crossing the Old North Road somewhere like this. He's also done quite a lot of sort of odd things with the roads to the southeast of the town. But nonetheless, it would give a traveller some idea of at least the general direction in which he or she was going. And this is one of the last of these sort of rather primitive maps of the county. John Carey, mapped in 1805. Carey was commissioned by the Postmaster General to survey English roads in the late 1790s. He produced maps of all the counties, which are effectively road maps. Doesn't show much else apart from the main roads as the mail coach routes that the post office was interested in. And this one is interesting in the sense if you look at the A10 going from Cambridge to Ely, it goes down to Milton, as it does more or less now, and then look what happens here. It goes all the way along the River Cam to Streatham, whereas, of course, nowadays we go straight across to Streatham. And I think that what they're showing here is the original course of the road, probably running along the flood bank of the river. And I don't know this, and I really one day must get down to Ely and have a look at the minute books of the Turnpike Trust to find out if, as I think, the road from Milton to Streatham is in fact a new one of the late 18th, early 19th century. Sorry, wrong way. Well, we move on now into the 19th century. And again, there are a lot of maps in the 18th century, absolute deluge of maps in the 19th century. And there are a number of reasons for this. And the first is that in Cambridgeshire, at least, there is continued agricultural change. We get parliamentary enclosure, the enclosure of the open fields. We get tithe commutation in 1839. We get further fen drainage schemes. On top of that, we get railway construction. And in other parts of the country, not as in Cambridgeshire, the need to identify mineral resources, and so geological maps are being produced for the first time, and particularly from about the 1850s, urbanisation. We need maps to enable the laying in of sewage, water supply schemes, new streets, and there's also slum clearance, all of the first efforts at slum clearance from the 1870s that again need maps. Many of them are still being published by private surveyors, but in the 19th century, of course, it is the Ordnance Survey which dominates the whole market. just one or two examples of private maps. And this is a very nice one. This is Watford and Richardson's map, showing the roads and boundaries of parishes for the distance of 8 miles round the University of Cambridge. So we are on Cambridge in the middle there, and these circles indicating 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, etc., from the town centre. And it was this one which I use as in the publicity for the talk. And it's an interesting map, shows quite a number of things. For example, here, this I think is the pole, is the telegraph line that ran from London to Yarmouth. This was the semaphore telegraph that had been laid in the Napoleonic War, with these towers signalling to each other. And so this one was signalling to one on Royston Heath, and in the other direction, northwards, signalling to Newmarket Heath. And this map is obviously, I think, aimed at a university clientele. And I like to think that this would be the map that Henslow and Darwin would use as they walked down Mill Road in the period out into Cherry Hinton Fen on their botanical and insect gathering expeditions. Parliamentary enclosure is, of course, a topic entirely on its own, and there isn't time to go into it, but parliamentary enclosure means that maps have to be produced showing who owns what in the parishes, and who is going to own what, when the open fields are divided up. And this is the map of Harston, 1799. This is the A10 coming down here into Harston. There again is the Z bend. We are going down towards Foxton. Here's the road going over to Haslingfield. And as you can see, it's an immensely detailed map showing the old enclosures here, the ones with all the writing on them, and the new allocations to landowners in the more outlying parts of the parish. Fen drainage is continuing, and importantly, in the first half of the 19th century because of the demand for food. And again, maps are produced very much in the tradition of the ones that we saw in the 17th century. And this is the map produced by Samuel Wells in 1830. Wells was the registrar of the Bedford Level Corporation, and was also, it seemed, a very skilled map maker. And this map is perhaps the best map of all of the fens. And what it shows is quite clearly all these lots that were given to the adventurers back in the 17th century. These are bits of land that still belong to the Bedford Level Corporation and are rented out. It shows highlands. So for the very first time, you can perhaps indicate the importance of the Isle of Ely. It is actually shown here, very clearly distinguished from the fens. Grunty Fen there in the middle. You've got other information down here. Sower Mere, for example, which was to be drained very shortly afterwards, down here. Really fascinating map and well worth having a look at. He also shows, in the northern end of the map, the changes that were being made to the estuaries. Because there was a feeling in the early 19th century that the big problem with fen drainage, in spite of what Vermeulen had done, was the condition of the outfalls. What you needed to do was to get water more quickly out to sea. And he shows here the two major schemes. On the right-hand side, the eastern side, the Obrink Cut of 1819, which cut off this great big loop of the Ouse here between Tilney and Clench Wharton, taking the water much more directly down to the sea. And it also shows over here the beginnings of the draining of the Cross Keys Wash, which is the outfall of the River Nene. And this had been basically, you'd have to cross this by ferry, or a very low tide, you could do it with a guide. It's a bit like going across Morecambe Bay. When the tide's out, you would not do it by yourself. In 1830, the road is built, a new bridge is put in, and the Cross Keys Marsh drained very quickly thereafter. The railways produce their own maps, and particularly many of these in the County Record Office deposited plans showing the exact course that the railway was going to take, and these were a legal requisite. These had to be provided by the railway companies, by the railway promoters, showing on a very large scale the route that the line would be taken and what we call the limits of deviation. So the dotted lines here are the limits of deviation. Here is the proposed line itself. And this is just an extract from one map in Shelford. If you know Shelford, basically, once again, the north is on the right here. Here is the railway. This is the A1301 coming down from Cambridge, from Trumpington. Those are the traffic lights. Here is going down towards London. This is Hinton Way. And one of the things that you can see on this is just how disruptive the railways were to this traditional landscape. Here it is cutting straight through all these old enclosures here. And one of the great features is that we do know from this, and it's very useful, is who actually owned and who was cultivating the various bits of land here, because it was always accompanied by a book of reference. And you can also see, I think, from this, how some land was virtually made useless by the coming of the railway. So you've got these tiny little bits here that really wouldn't be able to do anything with once the railway was built. And over here, we've got where Shelford Station is now. And you, as you might expect, we are going to see a train at some point in this talk. Here we are, we're standing in the middle of, go back, standing in plot 13 there, and we're looking across at plot 5 in the background. There's plot 5, which went to a man called Richard Headley, who very quickly realised the advantages of this bit of land near the station, built the station tavern here in 1847, 2 years after the line was opened, and also developed this big granary, the Shelford Corn and Coal Company, which survived until the 1980s. Moving back to the town, the big thing here, of course, again, is enclosure. That the open fields, the Barnwell Field and the Western Fields are enclosed in the first decade of the 19th century. And here we've got what was effectively the last year or so of Old Cambridge, the Cole and Roper's map of 1800. The town has hardly grown at all in physical area from when Loganon mapped it 120 years earlier. Here is the Moule map, Thomas Moule, 1830, showing how very clearly, of course, and we looked at this in the conference last year, the development of Barnwell in this rather piecemeal sort of way, and still a lot of open ground between Say Christ Pieces, for example, and East Road. Maps in quite a lot of detail, but not half as much detail as Baker's map of 1830, the first really detailed map that we have of the town, again reprinted by the Cambridgeshire Records Society back in the 1990s, I think, and sadly out of print now. A remarkably detailed map showing all the gardens, for example, and you can see very clearly here how Barnwell is growing. You've got their Maid's Causeway very clearly with those rather nice detached houses. Here is Willow Walk with its very rather different sort of houses, and it is a map which again repays a lot of study. Another map, less well known because it was never, I think, actually printed, or certainly not printed for public circulation, is by Richard Rowe, who was the surveyor, amongst other things, to the improvement commissioners. And he produced a map of the town in 1858, which is in some ways less useful than Baker's map. He simply shows street frontages, for example. So here we've got, once again, the area around the Museum of Cambridge. There's St Giles's Church. Here is Magdalen College. Here is Northampton Street. But nonetheless, again, bits of useful information. You get some of these little courts, which of course disappear in the 20th century with clearance of the slums. And also the site of the cattle market from the 1820s through to the 1880s and off Pound Hill, moved here from the town centre on grounds of hygiene as much as anything else, and then moved down to the station in the 1880s. And privately produced maps continue right through the 19th into the 20th century, although almost invariably using Ordnance Survey data. This is Spalding's map of 1881, and this was produced to accompany Spalding's famous street directories. Oops. And here, Heifers, for many, many years, did a map of Cambridge. This used to be included in virtually every guidebook to Cambridge, and this is the 1937 version, which, again, useful for showing things that have disappeared from the town centre, particularly, of course, with the redevelopment of the Grand Arcade, Lion Yard, etc. And that takes us on to the Ordnance Survey. The strange thing about the Ordnance Survey, perhaps, is that we don't know. There's a lot that we don't know about the Ordnance Survey. And one of the big problems is that in 1940, the headquarters of the Ordnance Survey in Southampton were bombed, which meant that a lot of documentation relating to the early years of the survey simply doesn't exist. And certainly a lot of public data enable us to say when particular maps were produced. The basis of the Ordnance Survey, of course, is military defence during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, with southeastern England being mapped at the scale of 1 inch to the mile from about 1795 onwards. And the survey was extended over the next 20 or 30 years. Cambridgeshire was surveyed round about 1810 and then again round about 1830. And this map was then produced originally round about 1839. The trouble is that the Ordnance Survey didn't date the maps. So you get these 1 inch maps. When is it produced? You've got to go on internal evidence. This one, I think, is somewhere between 1845 and 1851, simply because it shows the railway built in 1845. It does not show the Newmarket branch of 1851. Therefore, it must be sometime in that 6-year period. It shows the town more or less as it was in the 1830s. By the 1840s, 1850s, it would have grown rather more than this. You've still got a very, very rural-looking mill road down here, effectively petering out when you get to Pearlcat Farm. And one of the things you will notice is there are no contour lines on the map. They're showing the relief of the land by what is called hatchering, this sort of shading, which is not a major problem here, but as we will see in due course, was a major problem elsewhere. The map continues to be produced, again undated, simply adding yet more railways. So this, I think, is almost certainly late 1860s. It's got the London and North Western here coming in from the Bedford direction. It's got the Newmarket Railway here going out through Fulbourn. It's also, interestingly enough, got the original course of the Newmarket Railway, which was opened in 1848 down to Great Chesterford, closed in 1851. They don't seem to have realised that that was no longer there, so it's still shown. And again, you'll see in hatchering. Where you get areas like the Fens, this fact that you're trying to show relief isn't a particularly major problem. So, for example, if we're looking here at the Wisbech map, it is very, very clear indeed. When you get to more hilly areas, this is what happens. And this, It was a remarkably complicated map. These are the snow-covered Saffron Walden Alps as mapped in 1799 originally, at railways added. But you really got to work very, very hard to work out what's being shown on this map. And it's not surprising that by the 1870s, 1880s, particularly as the plates from which the maps were printed were getting more and more worn, there was increasing dissatisfaction with the Ordnance Survey. The problem with for the survey was that it was very limited in terms of manpower and finance, and it was only really from the late 1870s that at long last the Treasury started to open up the purse strings and allowed large-scale revision of the maps, which had never been possible before, and also to produce larger scale maps. Particularly the important one, the national coverage, the 6-inch map. Um, for towns, the first fruits of this new largesse were the very, very large-scale maps of towns with a population of more than 4,000 people. This is the Cambridge, of course, and what you've got here is East Road, Norfolk Street. This is at a scale of 10 feet to the mile, 120 feet to the inch, and it is very, very detailed indeed, showing different types of buildings according to where the colours, etc., all the indications of the industries, etc. Gardens are shown, individual trees even are shown, manhole covers are shown, and it is a really fantastic map. At the same time, a rather simpler map, the 25-inch map, was produced using the 10-foot data, but designed to be much simpler for more general use, and also designed to be reduced if needs be. And it was easily reduced from the 25-inch scale to the 6-inch scale. They simply took out and relettered a lot of the maps, but then produced the same data by photographic reproduction. And here we've got Mill Road in 1889, I think this map is. As you can see, it is once again quite detailed, but useful for all local historical purposes. It was then the second edition of the 6-inch map was completely redrawn and simplified. And this is the same area, early 20th century. But again, as you can see, a lot of the detail has gone, and there we are. The 1-inch maps also finally were republished, and this was done between 1890 and 1912, and simplified once again, and colours were introduced. Colours intended to show which roads were actually reasonable roads. And what you've got here, of course, is a reflection of a new market, the market of motorists and cyclists. And here we've got the area round about just to the west of Wisbech, around Murrow, etc. The roads that are marked in red are the ones that have got quite good surfaces. And this is generally carried on in the interwar period with, again, more and more prominence being given to roads. Here we've got the map of Cambridge, a new popular edition of 1921, which, again, although you can't see it very clearly on this reproduction, distinguishes it in the roads that are good for fast traffic, the main roads here, and in orange, and unfortunately it hasn't shown out very clearly on this slide, the roads which are good for most purposes, and then you've got completely uncoloured roads which are bad. And so, for example, for the road from Cherry Hinton to Teversham, which is nowadays, of course, a very important road, at this time is not surfaced. And this continues, this stress on road transport, throughout the rest of the 20th century. Here we've got the new popular edition of 1946, which had actually been surveyed just before the war, but wasn't produced during the war. And one of the interesting things is that it is much more up to date. It is showing the development of suburban Cambridge here. It's also showing, if you go back to the previous one, It's also showing how the orchards around Histon have developed, far more of them by the 1940s than there had been in the 1930s. There's also, of course, the 2.5 inch map. Now, the 2.5 inch has got a very odd history because this was produced at the request of the army, and it was not intended for public use. This is the map of the Cambridge area, or an extract of the map from the Cambridge area, 1912. And the thing the maps were produced because there is this fear of German invasion, and they're designed particularly for military purposes. They're designed to show, for example, telegraph lines, which you can just about make out perhaps running along there, along Newmarket Road. They're designed to show the width of bridges. They're designed to show which roads are suitable for troops. They're designed to show prominent landmarks and place things to be used as signal stations, etc. And also, although there is not shown on anywhere on this particular map, areas where, for example, you could water your horses, because, of course, cavalry is still all important. Well, these maps were obviously used by the military, and in the 1930s, the Ordnance Survey decided to use the scale without a great deal of enthusiasm. But producing the 2.5 inch map, the 1 to 25,000, basically using the old 6-inch map of the 19th century as the basis. Now, these are very nice maps, but they've got to be treated with a great deal of care because you've got to ask, what are they actually showing? And what they're basically showing is the landscape probably as it was in the late 19th century, early 20th century, with one or two very selective additions, like, for example, the numbering of roads and also the airfields, etc. And this was the Ordnance Survey policy, of course, that airfields are not shown in map. They are in any sort of form, it's simply blank ground. And if you look at this, the bottom of the map, here it tells you, compiled from 6-inch sheets, last revised 1896 to 1938, partial systematic revision 1938-52. So from the point of view of a landscape historian, although they're very valuable in some respects, say a great deal of caution. And this gives an indication of the selective revision that does take place. This is the map of Whistlesford, 1970. And as you can see, what's happened here is that they have shown the Whistlesford bypass past Whistlesford station with the old road there. They've put in the Sawston bypass. And in a very sort of amateurish sort of way, they've shown these two areas down here, which you may just remember there were two garages, one on each side of the Sawston bypass, in a rather sort of motorway sort of fashion, filling stations. But as I said, they haven't been shown with any precision at all. And the Ordnance Survey never seemed to be able to make up its mind whether it really wanted to publicise the 2.5 inch or not. Certainly, the covers didn't encourage you to come and buy them. The 1940s ones being produced like this, with this very bare cover, not even telling you where it is. It's SE99, and you've got to go to the back and have a look at the grid to see if you can identify precisely what's being shown. By the 1960s, 1970s, they move on to this sort of cover, which is perhaps even less come and buy me. I mean, it is simply this blank space with at least the name of where it's being shown. And it was only in the 1990s, after the map series, the whole map series was being threatened with being discontinued, there was a public outcry, particularly from walkers, cyclists, etc. And they finally decided to actually update the maps to become the Explorer series. And I believe now these are the Ordnance Survey's best-selling series. They're selling better than the 1 to 50,000. And they are very nice maps indeed. The Ordnance Survey for many years had a competitor, which I'm not going to go into detail, Bartholomew's, the Edinburgh map makers, who produced 1/2-inch maps, which were aimed deliberately at cyclists. So they started to produce them from about the 1890s onwards. They're very nice maps, and they do one thing which the Ordnance Survey doesn't, never has done. They show land below sea level. So here in the fens, you've actually got the bits that are below sea level, which you wouldn't find out really any other way. These maps continued to be produced until the 1970s, but gradually withdrawn from the market, and Bartholomew's is now part of Collins. The Ordnance Survey had a go at half-inch maps, but didn't do it at all successfully. This is the Wisbech map of around about 1904, direct reduction from the 1-inch map, but not an attractive map at all. Moving on, post-war, the 7th series of the 1-inch map, which I think is probably the best looking map the Ordnance Survey ever produced. Sorry about the big sort of shade there. This is the first map of Cambridge I ever bought, I think on my second weekend in Cambridge back in 1964. So as you can see, it's had rather a lot of use since then. But beautifully drawn, beautifully engraved, and very, very clear. And unlike modern Ordnance Survey maps, not overlain by tourist information. Well, tourist information, of course, is a different matter. This is one of the oddities of the Ordnance Survey, the tourist map of Cambridge, which was produced, I think, in 1968. And the Ordnance Survey has been producing tourist maps since the 1920s of areas of interest, like the Peak District, the Lake District, etc. Heaven only knows why they decided to do one of Cambridge, because if you open it up, it shows virtually nothing of tourist interest. And in fact, you've got to look very, very hard. You've got Wickham Fen shown, but that would be shown on the ordinary Ordnance Survey anyway. You've got a couple of places, 2 or 3 places where you can go fishing, up where, for example, and down here, and at Reach. I don't think you actually catch much up there in that bit of Reach road, but you never know. And even more oddly, Village College at Sawston. At Selham, which if people had turned up bearing this, imagine that they'd be able to look around this interesting village college, I think they'd have been sadly mistaken. But the Ordnance Survey did redeem itself. The city map of 1979, which is really using the last edition of the 6-inch map as its basis, but it's probably one of the best maps of Cambridge, I suspect, ever produced. It was extremely useful information at the time, showing you, for example, here in Mill Road, which directions you could turn at various places. And this is an oddity, and we'll finish up with just a couple of oddities. This is Heffer's map, the photo map, 1997. Now, if you look at the cover of Heffer's map, this is going to be incredibly useful. There it is, all the streets are named, etc. You open it up, and it's a big map. There is not a single bit of information. What you've got is this massive aerial photograph of Cambridge, with absolutely no way of relating it to what is actually there. So you wouldn't know from the map at all what this is. It's Churchill College, obviously, and you wouldn't know really anything at all that was going on. But it's, as I say, it's an interesting oddity. A type of map which has disappeared completely now is the bus map. This because they're threatened species, it is, I think, an extinct species, more or less, produced again down to the 1990s. This one, quite unremarkably, is 1968, produced by Eastern Counties, and it shows just how dense the bus network was 50 years ago. And I don't think, for example, you'd be able to get to Little Ouse or Shippey Hill by bus nowadays, and you certainly wouldn't be able to get to some of these very obscure fenland locations. And this one, again, very well known, obviously Cambridge, but of course it is the lettering that gives it away. This is the Soviet map of Cambridge, Cambridge being mapped, like most other British towns, by the Soviet Union in the 1970s, 1980s, mapped in a lot of detail, useful if you're learning Russian, if you want to know what Parker's Piece is in Russian, there it is down there, useful if you want to know what cricket ground is in Russian. And interestingly, more up to date than the Ordnance Survey. And this is possibly because of satellite imagery. Also, almost certainly, I think, because it is people on the ground who are supplying the information. So that's it. So the blatant commercials. The historical map of Cambridge, which Lucy mentioned at the beginning, which I was involved in producing, £10.99 from the Historic Towns Trust online, a map of the town, a lot of information about features on the rear, and I'm talking about this at the Museum of Cambridge on the 12th of March at 1 o'clock. The Cambridgeshire Records Society produced this volume of 12 maps in 2022, starting with line, going through to the second edition of the Ordnance Survey 6-inch, 2250, obtainable online, or if it was involved postage, of course, or you can get it down in the Cambridgeshire collection in the Cambridge Central Library. And well worth having, it comes accompanied by a booklet talking about the maps. And again, as Lucy mentioned, this new series of maps being produced by Alan Godfrey of selected bits of Cambridge and Cambridgeshire. This is Cambridge South, which came out just before Christmas. Again, with the map, 1925 in this case, and then a historical essay on the back describing what can be seen on the map. And these are the ones that are going to be produced that I know of. Cambridge North, Sherry Hinton is about to come out. Cheston and Fen Ditton is about to come out. Shelford and Whittlesford and Sawston are now out. And these are only £3.50 from Alan Godfrey Maps. So this series is ongoing and it'll be finished in April 2026. So there we are. That's it, folks. Thank you for listening, if you have been, indeed, if there is anyone still out there. And I'll try to answer any questions you may have in the next 10 minutes or so. So thank you.
Absolutely fascinating, Tony. Fascinating. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Tour de force, masses to get through, and I think, well, massive information on each map, so wonderful. And I'm really pleased to say that Tony's talk will go on to our YouTube channel if anyone wants to revisit any of that. So we'll take any questions, and I'm going to start at the beginning. For Anne McConville, she noticed on the John Hammond map reference to All Hallows in the Jury. Could you expand on this, please?
Yes, that's the old All Saints in the jury, which let's go back to it, see if I can find it. Actually, I know it takes too long. The original All Saints church, which was removed in the 1860s for the new one in Jesus Lane.
And so she asked, was there a Jewish community in Cambridge at this time, and where was it located?
There had been a Jewish community, and it was in that area. But I think, like everywhere else, the Jews had been excluded
Exactly.
ages, and only come back on the Cromwell in the 1650s when Jews were allowed back in. But this had been the jury back in the early Middle Ages.
Right. I was interested in that because of they were expelled about 1290, weren't they?
Right, yeah.
So I was just trying to mix, match the two ideas. Thank you very much.
Yes, but the name had lingered on. This was traditional.
Yes.
This was the Jewish quarter.
Thank you.
And there have been excavations there quite recently, haven't
Yes,
they,
they have,
by
yeah.
Cambridge Archaeology Unit. So you could follow that up as well. Quite a lot of work has been done on the bodies that have been excavated. The cemetery there.
Thank you.
Sorry. Julie Kay, what instruments did early road mappers use to try and get distances, proportions, and directions accurate?
This is beyond me because I'm not an expert on this at all. You need to talk to someone like Sarah Bendall to get the full view. They were using theodolites, obviously, for levelling. Distances were done by chains. literally physical chains measuring along the roads. This is certainly what Dr. Warren, wasn't it, who measured the road from Cambridge to Barkway. He'd got two or three people there with chains measuring, starting from Great St Mary's Church, working their way down King's Parade and out into the countryside. So it's a very labour-intensive process, and I think this explains, because of course even in the 19th century the Ordnance Survey are effectively still using the same methods. I think this explains why maps were not reissued and updated particularly often. It was incredibly labour-intensive doing it.
I don't think we've got Sarah with us tonight, have we? Sarah, are you there? No. This is from Bruce Sutherland. I live in Oakington, and I understand the Victorians changed the name from Hoddington to Oakington. Do you happen to know which year this change was made? Thanks.
No, I don't. And I suspect it was probably before the 19th century. It sounds to me much like something that would have originally been put on maps in the 17th, 18th centuries. And again, things being distorted, not in the telling the sense, but people picking up how they think things are pronounced and how they think that they're spelled. The standardization of place names really does only occur in the 19th century, though. And I think there are two things there. First of all, the Ordnance Survey, who obviously did need a correct spelling for places, but even they often got it wrong, particularly not so much in England, but in Ireland and Wales. They often completely misinterpreted place names, and this is why so many Welsh place names are rather odd. And secondly, of course, it was the post office, and they again demanded standardised spelling, although it took a long time for them to settle down. And so, for example, Wisbech didn't lose the A in the beach until I think 1878 or thereabouts. Whittlesea, again, didn't lose the A and become Whittlesea with a Y until about the 1890s. And interestingly enough, the railway still call Whittlesea with an A. Whittlesea station is still Whittlesea. Fulbourn, which hasn't got a station, but it's still a railway location, Fulbourn has still got an E on the end in railway parlance, which it hasn't had in real life, as it were, since about the 1870s. But things change rather slowly sometimes.
Thank you. This is Martin. At what year did Mill Road become connected at the East End? A lot of people claim it.
I'm sure you all know that. Yeah. You know this better than me. I think it's 1928, 29 or thereabouts. It's the Cambridge Eastern Bypass scheme, which I'm not quite sure when the bit of it at the end of Mill Road was done, but I suspect by 1930. But I'm sure somebody from Mill Road knows.
I think it was certainly by 1930. He goes on to say, a lot of people claim it was designed to be a through road, but the maps clearly show it wasn't, obviously spreading out from the centre instead, which explains its narrowness.
Yes, it is. I mean, it is simply leading out to Cherry Hinton Fen and to agricultural land, common grazing land, low-lying fenland, etc., and very much a dead end. I mean, I think that may be one reason, of course, why the sanatorium was down there, simply because it was a dead end, well away from the town.
So, Martin again, what was the rationale for not showing airfields in detail, but still showing that they exist?
It's a good point, actually, isn't it? Because if you're there and you're going to bomb them, you might just as well bomb the whole area. And it was, I mean, generally during the 19th, early 20th centuries, there was a gradual removal of anything that was regarded as strategic information from maps. And so, for example, if you buy 25-inch map of Dover, the reprints of a 25-inch map of Dover, there are great white spaces on the map of Dover because of all the fortifications on the western heights. They're simply not shown. For the same reason, what you also get during the 19th century is that the interiors of prisons cease to be shown, because they suddenly realised that actually showing what a prison is like inside is quite good if people are going to try and spring the prisoners. So in the 20th century, it just expands. So airfields, the location is shown if you're looking, and a lot of other information is taken off. So, for example, even on the 1-inch maps, if you look at the pre-war, pre-1939 editions of the 1-inch map, they would show something like cement works, brickworks, etc. Any indication of what was actually being produced in industries was taken off, and so it simply appears as works on the maps in the 1950s, 1960s. And it was only much later, really in the 1970s, that a lot of his information started to be shown again. They still obviously don't show the interior layout of prisons, but airfields, etc., those that remain, are shown in detail. I think the realization is that actually, satellite technology means that people know what is on the ground anyway, so you might just as well show it on the map.
Thank you. Then there's a bit of conversation about best sites for maps. Martin has said, given the National Library of Scotland with a website, Simon's commented on the National Library of Scotland again, and oldmapsonline.org. This is all on chat, so people can see this if they want. Lots of thanks, brilliance, fantastics, fascination. Everyone's really loved it. And then more conversation about, I'm just running through the chat, more conversation about map sources. And Jim Warren says, would you say anything about deliberate mistakes on maps to allow checking of when they are copied, please?
Well, apart from that, I do know that they were made. The Ordnance Survey and indeed some private map makers like Phillips, etc., would deliberately put an error on a map, a road that wasn't there, for example, just that they could pick up any infringement of copyright. And I don't know if it was actually done on any maps of Cambridge. I've got a feeling it was, but I just can't remember. But it was very common, and as I say, done for obvious reasons.
Martin is also commenting, are you familiar with the Open Street Map, which is a modern map of Cambridge produced early, entirely by volunteers with immense detail? Amazing difference between early 20th and 21st centuries.
I am now, yes. Thanks to, I think it was Martin who mentioned it to Simon, who passed the message on to me. So, yes, I am. So, thank you very much for that.
And then Elizabeth Bury comments on, it's got St Philip's Road going the wrong way. I'm not sure which map that is, but you probably know.
Yeah, actually, I had a look at that one, and it's an artifact of the way the map's displayed. It's actually showing that you've got the contraflow cycle lane. If you zoom in, you can see that, but if you zoom out, you just see arrows going the wrong way up the road and making it look like you can drive the wrong way up St Philip's Road. So that's more of an interesting technical bug rather than a map bug. Oh yes, and she's just next that, yeah.
Yes, comments going below. Hugh Cockwell asks, how far south to the 10-foot to the mile go in Cambridge? Do they cover the station area?
Yes, they did. Yes, it goes down to more or less the city boundary. So that's what was the city boundary, which is Cherry Hinton Road area. Certainly beyond Hills Road Bridge, and you get the railway shown in tremendous detail.
And you can see all those on the National Library of Scotland website.
Yes, they're all there. Yes.
Some of the maps are in a full form where you can just scroll around in the same way as you can on Google Maps. Some of them you actually have to go in and just view the individual sheets. But if you do that, you can see that all the Ordnance Survey maps, sort of as they're revised every 10 years or so. They're missing a couple, but they've got nearly all of them there. It takes a bit of work to dig through and see them, but you can see them. In fact, you can buy downloads of them for about 15 quid each tile as well. So if you're keen, it's a good way of building up a library.
I mean, the National Library of Scotland is a fantastic resource. It started out just with the maps of Scotland, and they've gradually expanded themselves to England and Wales, and maps indeed from all over Europe and the world. And one of the things that it does show very clearly how the southern England, and particularly East Anglia, was very much at the back of the queue when it comes to mapping. You get the 6-inch maps covering the area effectively north of the line from the Humber to the Mersey of the 1850s. Nothing in Cambridgeshire until the 1880s, and the same with the larger scale maps as well. It's the industrial areas of the north that get all the attention from the relatively small staff that the Ordnance Survey had.
Well, it makes a change, doesn't it, for the north to get the attention? So.
It does, yes.
Martin also comments on the geography department has a lot of aerial imagery dating back since the 1950s. There is also the aerial photography department. Perhaps that went into geography. A mass of data. Archaeologists use a lot, as do lots of other people. And that's cambridgephotos.com. So I think I've got everything, but if there's something that somebody hasn't, I haven't picked up, could you identify yourselves and
there's a couple more there. There was one Janet asking if the Ordnance Survey will continue to put in paper maps in future, do you think, or do you think they'll just go entirely digital?
I'd hope that they will produce paper maps. I mean, there is nothing to beat a paper map. Simply to sit and look at it and get an idea of the topography, which you simply cannot do from a small-scale map on a mobile phone or on your PC, etc. So I think there will always be a demand. I mean, the price will doubtless go up, but I think the 1 to 50,000 and the 1 to and the 2.5-inch series, I think are certainly safe. I saw somebody asking about books about fen drainage, and someone suggested Imperial Mud was a good one, and it is. I must admit, I can't remember the author off the top of my head.
James Boyce.
Sorry?
James Boyce.
That's
James
right.
Boyce.
We had him do a talk a few years ago, didn't we?
I thought so, yes. Yes, that's the most recent one, I believe. There is the old one by H.C. Darby on the draining of the fen.
Oh yes, that's the real Bible of it.
It is, yeah.
James Boyce's volume is more political than Darby.
Very much so, yes.
And both of them are really worth looking at. Yeah.
And there's the one on the technology, machines, mills, and uncountable costly necessities. And again, I can't remember the author of that, but that's very, very technical, actually, on the machinery of the pumping houses.
Well, anything else? Anybody else would like to comment? Or Tony, it's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.